Truth rarely arrives as comfort. It arrives as disruption. It strips away the stories we tell about ourselves and demands a harsher question. Who are you when every illusion is removed? Most people believe identity is something stable, something inherited from family, culture, or success. But that belief collapses the moment life begins to fracture. Crisis reveals what comfort hides. Beneath the surface of routine, another struggle is always unfolding. A struggle between the person we appear to be and the person we are becoming. Long before the modern language of psychology became popular, Hermann Hesse had already confronted this inner battlefield. In a Europe shaken by spiritual disorientation and the collapse of old values, he refused easy answers. While many still trusted the stability of society, Hesse turned inward and treated the human soul as a landscape of conflict, longing, and transformation. His novels did not merely tell stories, they exposed the silent war inside the individual. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Hesse understood something unsettling. The human being is not a finished identity. The self is a process, a struggle, a journey through division, doubt, and painful awakening. Characters such as Siddhartha, Harry Haller, and Emile Sinclair are not simply literary creations. They are experiments in philosophical self-discovery, living demonstrations of a deeper question. How does a human being become truly themselves? To understand that question, we must begin with the first and most radical idea at the center of Hesse's thought. The journey towards selfhood itself is a philosophical method. The search for the self is not a poetic metaphor. It is a brutal philosophical demand. Human beings do not simply live. They are forced to become. Beneath every habit, every belief, every social role, there is a silent question waiting like a blade in the dark. Who are you when everything borrowed is stripped away? Most philosophies attempt to answer life by constructing systems. They build structures of logic, categories, definitions. Hermann Hesse refused this path. For him, truth does not emerge from abstract argument. It emerges from lived transformation. Philosophy, in his vision, is not something one explains. It is something one undergoes. Long before modern psychology popularized the language of self-discovery, Hesse had already turned the inner life into a battlefield of philosophical inquiry. When Europe still believed that identity could be secured by tradition, religion, and social order, he saw the fracture beneath the surface. When the world clung to inherited meanings, he sensed that the individual would soon be left alone with a far more terrifying task: to construct meaning from within. This is why the figures that inhabit his works are not merely fictional characters. They are experiments in existence. Each one is placed into a psychological furnace. Each one is stripped of illusions until only the raw confrontation with the self remains. As the outline of his thoughts suggests, the journey towards selfhood becomes not a narrative theme, but a philosophical method itself. The first claim is simple but devastating. Truth cannot be handed down. It must be lived. Hesse understood something that many systematic philosophers overlooked. A doctrine can be learned without changing the person who learns it. A book can be read without altering the soul that reads it. But a genuine existential realization shatters the structure of identity. It demands transformation. This is why his characters rarely receive answers from teachers, institutions, or sacred texts. Instead, they are forced into experiences that dissolve certainty. They wander, they fail, they contradict themselves, they destroy what they once believed. Through this process, the individual does not accumulate knowledge. The individual becomes different. The essence of the method is radical personalization of truth. In traditional philosophy, a concept is valid because it is logically coherent or universally applicable. In Hesse's vision, truth gains legitimacy only when it becomes inseparable from the life that embodies it. A truth that has not transformed the individual is merely information. This idea strips philosophy of its comfort. It removes the distance between thinker and thought. If truth demands personal transformation, then every philosophical question becomes dangerous. Because it no longer asks what the world is, it asks what you must become. Here, the journey to selfhood unfolds through three fundamental movements. First comes unrest. Every protagonist in Hesse's world begins with a vague but unbearable dissatisfaction. Life appears stable on the surface, yet something inside refuses to accept it. The individual senses that the life being lived is not truly their own. Roles feel imposed. Values feel borrowed. Meaning feels artificial. This unrest is not a flaw. It is the beginning of awakening. Most people silence this discomfort. They bury it under routine, social approval, and familiar beliefs. But the characters in Hesse's universe cannot silence it. Something within them insists on confrontation. The quiet rebellion of the soul begins. Second comes division. Once the search begins, the self fractures. The individual discovers that identity is not a single coherent entity. Instead, it is a battlefield of conflicting forces. Reason fights instinct. Morality clashes with desire. Spiritual aspiration collides with animal vitality. This inner conflict is not accidental. It reveals the deeper structure of human existence. For centuries, Western culture attempted to portray the self as unified and rational. Hesse rejected this illusion. To become oneself, one must first recognize that the self is already divided. Identity contains multiplicity. Harmony cannot be achieved by denying the darker impulses of the psyche. It can only emerge through confronting them. Third comes transformation. The individual must pass through experiences that dismantle the false unity imposed by society. Old identities collapse. Former beliefs lose authority. The person becomes temporarily lost. But this loss is essential because only after the collapse of borrowed identities can something authentic begin to form. The journey towards selfhood therefore resembles an alchemical process. The personality dissolves before it can be rebuilt. Certainty must die so that consciousness can deepen. What makes Hesse's approach radical is that he does not present this process as a theoretical framework. He dramatizes it through living characters. Consider the symbolic function of Siddhartha. He does not represent the triumph of enlightenment in a simple moral sense. He represents the refusal to inherit wisdom secondhand. Teachers offer him doctrines. Religions offer him systems. Yet he walks away from all of them. Why? Because truth that arrives ready-made cannot become part of the soul. Siddhartha must experience life directly. He must taste desire, wealth, exhaustion, despair. Only through living contradictions can he discover the unity beneath them. The same pattern emerges in the figure of Emile Sinclair. At the beginning, he inhabits the safe moral universe of childhood. Everything appears divided into good and evil, order and chaos, purity and corruption. But this clarity is an illusion created by social conditioning. As Sinclair grows, the world reveals its complexity. The boundaries between good and evil blur. The self reveals hidden depths. What once appeared sinful may contain vitality. What once appeared virtuous may conceal emptiness. Through this collapse of simple moral categories, the individual is forced to construct a deeper form of understanding. Not obedience, not rebellion for its own sake, but conscious self-formation. Even the tormented Harry Haller embodies the same philosophical experiment. He experiences himself as split between cultured intellect and wild instinct. He believes he is two incompatible beings trapped in one body. Yet the deeper insight that emerges later is more unsettling. The self is not two, it is countless. Identity is a multiplicity. This revelation dismantles the traditional idea of a stable personality. It forces the individual to confront a far more fluid and dynamic conception of existence. To become oneself is not to discover a fixed essence. It is to orchestrate the many voices within. This insight was extraordinarily ahead of its time. Long before contemporary psychology embraced the complexity of the psyche, Hesse had already recognized that human identity cannot be reduced to a single rational center. And yet the importance of this philosophy becomes even more visible in the modern world. Today, people believe they possess more freedom than any generation before. Technology expands choice. Social structures appear flexible. Identities can be reinvented endlessly. On the surface, individuality seems triumphant. But beneath this appearance lies a deeper paradox. The modern individual is surrounded by options, but disconnected from the inner authority required to choose. Algorithms suggest desires. Social media mirrors expectations. Cultural narratives provide ready-made identities to adopt. The individual appears free, but often lives through imitation. Hesse's philosophy cuts through this illusion with ruthless clarity. Becoming oneself cannot occur through external customization. It requires internal confrontation. No technology can perform that work. No cultural trend can replace it, because the real obstacle is psychological. Human beings fear the emptiness that appears when inherited meanings collapse. They fear the silence that emerges when social identities dissolve. They fear the responsibility of creating value rather than receiving it. This fear drives most people back toward conformity. They prefer a comfortable identity to an authentic one. Hesse exposes this tendency without mercy. The journey toward selfhood demands solitude. It demands uncertainty. It demands the courage to endure periods where the individual does not know who they are anymore. Few are willing to face that abyss. Yet those who do discover something extraordinary. The self is not found at the beginning of the journey. It is forged through the journey itself. Identity becomes an achievement. This insight leads to a deeper psychological truth. The greatest suffering in the search for selfhood does not come from external hardship. It comes from internal contradiction. Inside every individual, there is a struggle between safety and authenticity. Safety whispers that belonging is more important than truth. Authenticity whispers that living falsely is a slow form of death. The tension between these voices produces anxiety, doubt, loneliness. Yet these painful states are not signs of failure. They are signs that the individual has begun to awaken, because the person who has never questioned their identity has never truly encountered themselves. The characters in Hesse's works illustrate this dynamic with striking intensity. They do not represent heroic perfection. They represent the psychological turbulence required for genuine transformation. Through them, we see that selfhood is not a destination. It is a process of continual confrontation. Every illusion destroyed opens a deeper layer of awareness. Every crisis reveals hidden aspects of the psyche. Every moment of despair forces the individual to search for meaning beyond inherited structures. In this sense, Hesse transforms literature into a philosophical laboratory. The characters are not there to entertain. They are there to expose the anatomy of becoming. And this anatomy reveals something both liberating and terrifying. The individual cannot escape the responsibility of self-creation. No institution can complete the task. No doctrine can finish the work. Every human life must face the same demand: to move from imitation toward authenticity. This demand does not disappear with progress. In the world of 2025, it may even be more urgent. The louder the external world becomes, the easier it is to ignore the quiet voice within. The more identity society offers, the harder it becomes to recognize which one truly belongs to us. But the inner conflict does not vanish. It waits, and eventually it asks the same relentless question that echoes through every one of Hesse's philosophical experiments. What remains when the roles collapse? What remains when the borrowed meanings fall away? What remains when the individual finally stands alone before their own consciousness? At that threshold, the journey towards selfhood truly begins. And once that door opens, the individual must confront an even more unsettling discovery. The self they seek is not a single harmonious unity, but a restless field of opposing forces struggling beneath the surface of the human soul. The self that begins to awaken soon discovers a brutal truth. The human being is not whole. Beneath the fragile mask of identity lives a deep and relentless division. Consciousness demands order, meaning, elevation. Instinct demands pleasure, power, survival. Between these two forces, the human soul is stretched like a rope, pulled in opposite directions. This division is not an accident of personality. It is the structure of human existence itself. For centuries, Western culture attempted to hide this fracture. Religion preached spiritual purity. Civilization celebrated rational control. Society rewarded discipline and moral conformity. The human being was expected to overcome instinct and ascend toward a higher order of reason. But beneath this idealized image, something darker continued to move. Desire did not disappear. Aggression did not dissolve. Fear, sexuality, hunger for dominance, and the wild pulse of life itself remained buried within the psyche. Civilization did not erase these forces, it simply forced them underground. Hermann Hesse saw this hidden conflict with devastating clarity, and he refused to soften its implications. When the modern individual begins the search for selfhood, the first discovery is not harmony, it is contradiction. The self reveals itself as a battlefield where spirit and nature collide. This insight did not appear in isolation. It emerged from a moment in intellectual history when the foundations of Western self-understanding were already cracking. Long before the language of modern psychology became common, two thinkers had already begun to dismantle the comforting myth of a unified human being. Friedrich Nietzsche shattered the illusion of moral purity. Sigmund Freud exposed the unconscious depths of instinct. Hesse absorbed both of these shocks and transformed them into narrative experience. Nietzsche declared that beneath moral ideals, there often hides the will to power. What society calls virtue may simply be the strategy of the weak to restrain the strong. Moral systems do not descend from heaven. They emerge from struggle, fear, and domination. Freud went even further into the darkness of the psyche. He argued that consciousness is only the thin surface of the mind. Beneath it lies a vast, unconscious region filled with impulses the civilized self refuses to acknowledge. Together, these insights produced a terrifying possibility. What if the human being is not a rational creature, temporarily disturbed by instinct, but a conflicted organism in which instinct is permanent and irreducible? Hesse did not answer this question with theoretical essays. He forced his characters to live it. In his world, the individual cannot simply choose between spirit and instinct. Both forces are real. Both demand expression. Both shape the structure of identity. To deny instinct is to amputate vitality. To surrender entirely to instinct is to abandon consciousness. The human being, therefore, lives within tension. This tension appears first as moral confusion. The person raised within strict ethical boundaries begins to encounter impulses that those rules cannot explain. Desires arise that feel both forbidden and irresistibly alive. The soul experiences guilt not because something is objectively wrong, but because two incompatible worlds collide inside the same consciousness. This conflict is not a temporary stage. It is the permanent drama of being human. The civilized self wants clarity. It wants to believe that good and evil can be neatly separated, that reason can rule the passions, that identity can be stable. But the deeper one looks into the psyche, the more fragile this order becomes. Hesse exposes this fragility through the psychological journey of his characters. Their internal divisions are not pathologies, they are revelations. Consider again the symbolic figure of Emile Sinclair. As a child, he lives in a protected world where morality appears simple and absolute. There is a bright realm of goodness and a dark realm of sin. His family represents order, faith, and purity. But the moment Sinclair begins to encounter the darker aspects of existence, this neat structure collapses. He discovers that the human soul cannot be divided so cleanly. What society condemns may also contain vitality and truth. What society praises may conceal emptiness and fear. Through this realization, Sinclair confronts a disturbing insight. The self contains both light and darkness. The attempt to destroy one side of this duality only produces hypocrisy. True self-knowledge requires acknowledging both forces. This idea becomes even more radical in the tormented consciousness of Harry Haller. He believes himself to be split between two beings. One side is refined, intellectual, cultured. The other is wild, instinctual, almost animalistic. He calls himself a wolf trapped in human civilization. At first, this division appears tragic. Haller interprets it as proof that he is fundamentally broken. He cannot fully belong to the respectable world of culture, yet he cannot abandon it either. He lives suspended between two incompatible identities. But the deeper truth hidden within this conflict is far more complex. The human being is not divided into two simple halves. The psyche contains countless forces interacting simultaneously. Rational discipline, creative impulse, aggression, compassion, erotic desire, spiritual longing, destructive rage, all coexist within the same internal universe. Civilization attempts to reduce this complexity to a single acceptable identity. But the individual who begins the journey inward soon discovers that such simplification is impossible. The self is plural. Hesse understood that the most dangerous illusion in human life is the belief that one can eliminate the darker aspects of existence and still remain whole. Every attempt to purify the soul produces repression, and what is repressed does not disappear. It returns in distorted forms. Cruelty disguised as righteousness, fanaticism disguised as moral certainty, hatred disguised as virtue. This psychological mechanism explains many of the darkest movements in human history. When individuals deny their own inner chaos, they often project it onto the external world. They identify enemies who supposedly embody everything they refuse to recognize within themselves. The result is collective violence driven by unconscious fear. In this sense, the division between spirit and instinct is not merely a personal struggle. It is a civilizational problem. Modern societies often present themselves as rational and progressive. They celebrate technological advancement and intellectual sophistication. Yet beneath this surface, the same ancient instincts continue to shape behavior. Competition for power, desire for domination, fear of the unfamiliar. The difference is that modernity hides these impulses behind complex systems and ideologies. Hesse saw this hypocrisy clearly. He understood that civilization often demands spiritual ideals while secretly relying on instinctual drives to sustain itself. The individual who recognizes this contradiction becomes alienated. They no longer fully believe the official narratives of society. Yet they also cannot return to naive innocence. They are forced into a deeper confrontation with their own nature. And this confrontation produces psychological suffering. To acknowledge instinct is frightening because it reveals how fragile moral identity can be. The individual begins to realize that beneath the civilized surface lies a reservoir of impulses capable of both creativity and destruction. But this recognition also opens the possibility of integration. If instinct is denied, it becomes destructive. If instinct is acknowledged and understood, it can become a source of vitality. The task is not suppression. The task is conscious relationship. This is where Hesse's philosophy becomes both existential and psychological. The human being must learn to stand between spirit and nature without collapsing into either extreme. Spirit without instinct becomes sterile abstraction. Instinct without spirit becomes blind chaos. True selfhood emerges only when the individual confronts both forces and refuses to falsify either one. Yet achieving this balance is extraordinarily difficult. because society constantly pressures individuals to simplify themselves, to choose a single identity, to become predictable. But the human soul is not predictable. Inside every person there exists a wild landscape that cannot be fully domesticated. The search for authenticity, therefore, requires courage. Not the heroic courage celebrated by society, but the quieter and more terrifying courage of self-confrontation. To look inward without illusion, to admit impulses that contradict one's ideals, to recognize that the self contains both creator and destroyer. Few people are willing to face this reality. Most prefer the comfort of moral clarity. They divide the world into good and evil, light and darkness, civilization and barbarism. But this division is a projection of the very conflict they refuse to acknowledge within themselves. Hesse dismantles this illusion with relentless precision. He forces the reader to see that the boundary between spirit and instinct does not run through society. It runs through every individual consciousness. And once that realization occurs, the individual stands before a new and unsettling problem. If the self is divided, and if neither side can be eliminated, then what force can hold these opposing elements together? What principle can transform inner conflict into meaningful existence? The search for that unifying force leads beyond simple morality, beyond social conformity, beyond inherited belief systems. It demands a deeper listening to the hidden voice that moves beneath both instinct and intellect, a voice that begins to call from the darkest interior of the psyche and demands to be heard. The moment the individual begins to hear that hidden voice, another realization follows with brutal clarity. The greatest obstacle to becoming oneself is not instinct, it is society. Civilization promises order, safety, and identity. But beneath this promise lies a quiet violence. Society does not merely organize life, it standardizes it. It molds the individual into a predictable form that can be recognized, approved, and controlled. This is the world Hermann Hesse relentlessly exposes, a world where spiritual mediocrity hides behind respectability, a world where conformity is rewarded and authenticity is treated as a threat. The bourgeois world is not merely an economic class. It is a psychological structure. It is the world of moderation without depth, comfort without meaning, morality without inner struggle. Everything is balanced, polite, stable, and yet beneath that stability lies a profound emptiness. Hesse saw this environment long before the modern age fully recognized its spiritual consequences. When Europe still celebrated its cultural refinement and social order, he sensed a quiet decay spreading beneath the polished surface. People were living lives that no longer belonged to them. Tradition had weakened. Religion had lost authority. Yet the structures of respectability remained. The result was a society filled with individuals who performed identity rather than lived it. This performance defines the bourgeois mentality. The bourgeois individual fears extremes. They fear chaos, suffering, rebellion, intensity. They value safety above truth. Their highest virtue is stability. But stability comes with a price. To maintain social harmony, the individual must silence the deeper forces of the soul. The wild instincts revealed earlier must be suppressed. The longing for spiritual transformation must be ignored. The internal contradictions that define human existence must be hidden behind polite behavior. This suppression produces a life that appears peaceful, but is inwardly sterile. Hesse understood that such a life may function socially, but it slowly suffocates the spirit. The person becomes efficient, responsible, even admirable in the eyes of society. Yet something inside grows increasingly numb. This numbness is the true crisis of modern civilization. People continue working, building families, fulfilling roles. From the outside, everything appears stable, but internally, many individuals experience an unspoken emptiness. They sense that the life they are living was designed for someone else. The bourgeois world offers comfort in exchange for authenticity. Hesse's characters cannot accept this exchange. They begin inside that world, often raised within its values. They inherit its moral codes, its expectations, its belief in orderly life. But sooner or later, something cracks. A moment of existential tension appears. The individual realizes that beneath social stability lies spiritual stagnation. And once this realization occurs, the bourgeois structure begins to collapse. This collapse is not dramatic at first. It begins with quiet dissatisfaction. The individual feels restless without knowing why. Activities that once seemed meaningful now feel mechanical. Social rituals appear artificial. This discomfort slowly evolves into rebellion. But the rebellion in Hesse's philosophy is not political in the ordinary sense. It is existential. The individual does not merely reject specific institutions. They reject the psychological framework that demands conformity. They begin to question every inherited value. Why must life follow this path? Why must success be defined in this way? Why must the individual sacrifice inner truth for social acceptance? These questions destabilize the foundations of bourgeois identity because the bourgeois world depends on silent agreement. It functions only if individuals accept its values without radical examination. The moment someone begins to question those assumptions, the system reveals its fragility. Hesse dramatizes this rupture through characters who gradually detach from the social order that raised them. Emile Sinclair experiences this when he realizes that the moral clarity of his childhood world is artificial. The neat separation between good and evil is a convenient fiction that protects social stability. But the real world is far more ambiguous. Harry Haller experiences the rupture even more violently. He sees bourgeois society as spiritually dead. Polite conversations, respectable careers, cultural refinement, all of it feels hollow to him. Yet his hatred of bourgeois life hides a deeper contradiction. He cannot completely escape it. Part of him still longs for its safety, its order, its familiarity. This tension produces profound psychological suffering. Haller is trapped between two incompatible worlds, the stability of society and the chaotic freedom of the individual. This inner conflict reveals something essential about the process of awakening. The individual who rejects bourgeois conformity does not immediately become free. Instead, they enter a dangerous territory where identity dissolves. Because the structures that once defined life are gone, the person who abandons social norms must confront a terrifying question. If society no longer determines who I am, then who decides? Freedom is exhilarating, but it is also unbearable. Most individuals retreat from this abyss. They return to familiar roles. They rebuild a comfortable identity within the boundaries of society. But Hesse's seekers refuse this retreat. They continue moving deeper into uncertainty. This is why the destruction of the bourgeois world is not simply an act of rebellion. It is a necessary stage in the philosophical journey towards selfhood. As long as the individual remains fully integrated into the expectations of society, genuine self-discovery cannot begin. The individual must step outside the system that defined them. Yet this step produces isolation. Society rewards those who conform. It mistrusts those who deviate. The individual who begins to live authentically often appears strange, unstable, even dangerous to the surrounding world. Friends become distant. Social approval disappears. The seeker stands alone. This loneliness is not a failure of the journey. It is an unavoidable consequence of it. Because authenticity requires separation from collective illusions. Hesse's vision of this process was remarkably prophetic. In the world of 2025, the pressure to conform has not disappeared. It has simply taken new forms. Modern society celebrates individuality on the surface. People are encouraged to express themselves, to pursue personal identity, to be unique. But beneath this celebration lies a subtle form of control. Culture produces endless models of identity for individuals to adopt. Lifestyles, ideologies, aesthetic trends, digital personas. Each one promises authenticity while quietly guiding behavior into predictable patterns. The individual believes they are expressing freedom, yet often they are simply selecting from pre-designed options. The bourgeois mentality survives within this system. It still fears true deviation. It still rewards conformity disguised as personal expression. It still discourages the deeper confrontation with existence that authentic individuality requires. Hesse's critique, therefore, remains disturbingly relevant. Because the real problem was never merely economic class. It was spiritual complacency. The bourgeois spirit avoids extremes. It avoids inner chaos. It avoids existential questioning. It prefers moderate happiness to radical truth. But the human soul is not satisfied with moderation. Inside every person exists a hunger for something deeper, a desire to experience life with intensity, authenticity, and meaning. When this hunger is ignored, the result is quiet despair. Many people feel this despair without understanding its origin. They assume the problem lies in external circumstances, a better job, a different city, a new relationship. But these changes rarely resolve the deeper tension, because the real issue is not environment, it is identity. The individual is living according to a script that was never truly chosen. Hesse's characters expose this condition with ruthless honesty. They show that the destruction of bourgeois life is not primarily about rejecting comfort or stability. It is about rejecting a false definition of the self. The person must dismantle the identity constructed by society. Only then can something authentic begin to emerge. But once the social mask falls, another challenge appears. Without the structures of society, the individual confronts the raw complexity of the inner world. Instinct, desire, fear, ambition, creativity, guilt. All these forces begin to move freely. The seeker must now learn to navigate this inner landscape without external guidance. And this task is far more difficult than rebellion. Destroying a false identity is only the beginning. The deeper challenge is listening for the voice that exists beneath both social conditioning and instinctual chaos. A voice that does not belong to society, yet does not reject existence. A voice that calls the individual toward a deeper integration of the self. And it is precisely at the moment when the old world collapses and the new self has not yet been born, that the individual begins to hear something unfamiliar rising from within, something quieter than rebellion, but far more powerful, something that demands attention with a force that cannot be ignored. The quiet force that begins to rise after the collapse of social identity is not an idea, it is a summons. Something within the human being begins to demand recognition, not from society, not from institutions, but from the individual consciousness itself. This is the moment when the deepest conflict of human existence reveals its true direction. The destruction of false identities creates a void, and within that void, a voice begins to speak. The inner self calls. This call is not gentle. It does not flatter the ego. It does not promise comfort or certainty. It demands confrontation. It demands transformation. It demands that the individual stop living according to borrowed meanings and begin listening to the deeper structure of their own being. Many people feel this call but misunderstand it. They interpret it as dissatisfaction with circumstances. They assume the solution lies in changing external conditions, a new career, a new city, a new relationship, a new belief system. But the voice persists because it is not asking for a different life. It is asking for a different relationship to the self. Hermann Hesse recognized this phenomenon long before modern psychology developed the language to describe it. When the scientific study of the unconscious was still emerging, he had already understood that beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness lives a deeper center of identity. This center does not speak through logic. It speaks through unrest, through dreams, through sudden intuitions that disrupt the stability of the everyday self, through a strange sense that the person we present to the world is only a fragment of what we truly are. The bourgeois world attempts to silence these signals. Society teaches individuals to value predictability, to build identities that function smoothly within established structures. But the deeper psyche refuses to remain silent forever. Sooner or later, the individual encounters experiences that crack the mask. A crisis, a moment of overwhelming confusion, a sudden awareness that life is being lived on the surface while something essential remains unexplored. At this point, the inner self begins to demand attention. The psychological meaning of this moment is profound. The individual begins to realize that identity has layers. The surface layer is constructed by society. It consists of roles, habits, moral expectations, cultural definitions of success and failure. This layer allows the person to function within the external world. But beneath this social self lies something far more complex, a deeper structure of impulses, desires, intuitions, and potentials that were never allowed to develop. This deeper layer contains both the light and the darkness of the human psyche, creativity and destruction, compassion and cruelty, wisdom and madness. Most individuals spend their entire lives avoiding direct contact with this interior world. Hesse's characters cannot avoid it. They are pushed into confrontation with their own depths. And once this confrontation begins, the individual discovers that the inner self is not passive. It is active. It seeks expression. This is why the awakening of the inner self often produces instability. The personality that society built begins to lose authority. The individual no longer feels fully identified with the roles they once performed automatically. They experience a strange distance from their own habits. The life that once seemed natural now appears artificial. This psychological transformation resembles what depth psychology later called the process of individuation. The individual begins separating from the collective patterns that shape their identity and starts forming a unique relationship with their own unconscious forces. But this process is not comfortable. To listen to the inner self means abandoning the illusion that identity is simple. It means accepting that the psyche contains contradictions that cannot be resolved through conventional morality. The individual must learn to hold complexity, to accept that instincts previously condemned by society may contain energy necessary for growth, to accept that ideals previously celebrated by society may hide fear and repression. The inner self does not obey social rules. It follows a deeper logic. Hesse illustrates this confrontation through the symbolic influence of guiding figures that appear within his narratives. These figures do not function as traditional teachers. They do not impose doctrines or moral systems. Instead, they provoke awakening. Demian performs this role for Emile Sinclair. He does not give Sinclair a comfortable philosophy. Instead, he dismantles Sinclair's inherited moral universe. He reveals that the rigid distinction between good and evil is a simplification created by society to maintain order. The human soul is far more complex. Within every individual exists both the creative and destructive forces of existence. To deny one side of this reality is to deny life itself. Demian forces Sinclair to look directly at this complexity. He reveals that the true task of human development is not obedience to external law, but loyalty to the deeper truth emerging from within the individual psyche. This idea is radical. It transforms morality from a system of rules into a process of self-confrontation. The individual must ask not merely what society expects, but what their own inner development demands. This shift introduces an entirely new dimension of responsibility, because the voice of the inner self cannot be followed blindly. The unconscious contains both wisdom and danger. To follow instinct without reflection leads to chaos. To obey society without questioning leads to spiritual stagnation. The individual must therefore cultivate awareness. They must learn to observe the movements of their own psyche with honesty, to recognize when impulses arise from fear, when they arise from genuine vitality, and when they arise from the deeper direction of personal growth. This task requires courage, because the inner self does not guide the individual towards social approval. Often, it demands actions that appear irrational or threatening to the surrounding world. It may call the individual to abandon secure paths, to question beloved beliefs, to embrace uncertainty. Most people resist this call. They feel its presence but retreat into familiar identities. They silence the voice through distraction, routine, and external validation. The result is a life that remains stable yet incomplete. Hesse's seekers refuse this retreat. They follow the voice even when it leads them into darkness. This darkness is not evil in the conventional sense. It is the unexplored territory of the psyche, the parts of identity that were suppressed in order to maintain social acceptance. To explore this territory is frightening because it reveals aspects of the self that contradict the image we prefer to believe. But this exploration also unlocks hidden potential. The creative force of the individual often resides in the same depths that society labels dangerous. Imagination, passion, rebellion, and visionary insight all emerge from the regions of the psyche that lie beyond conventional order. When the individual begins to integrate these forces consciously, a new kind of personality begins to form. A personality no longer defined primarily by social expectations. A personality shaped by inner necessity. Yet, this transformation introduces another paradox. The deeper the individual listens to the inner self, the more they realize that identity is not a fixed essence waiting to be discovered. It is a process. The voice within does not reveal a final destination. It reveals a direction. The individual becomes someone who is constantly evolving, constantly confronting new layers of the psyche, constantly renegotiating the balance between instinct and consciousness. This realization dismantles one more illusion, the illusion that the self can ever be completed. Instead, the individual learns to live in dialogue with their own becoming. Hesse understood that this dialogue would become even more urgent in the world of 2025. A world filled with endless noise, information, and external stimulation. In such a world, the quiet voice of the inner self becomes easy to ignore. Yet it does not disappear. It continues to whisper beneath the distractions of modern life, beneath digital identities, professional ambitions, and cultural expectations. It asks the same question that has haunted every seeker across centuries. Are you living according to the truth that is emerging within you? Or are you performing a life designed by others? This question cannot be answered once and for all. It must be faced repeatedly as the individual grows. And as the seeker continues listening to this deeper voice, another transformation slowly begins to unfold. The inner world that once appeared chaotic starts revealing unexpected patterns. Opposites that once seemed irreconcilable begin to hint at a hidden unity that stretches far beyond the boundaries of the individual self. The hint of unity that begins to appear within the depths of the psyche seduces the human mind with a powerful promise. If the contradictions of existence could somehow dissolve into harmony, suffering itself might lose its meaning. The divided soul might finally become whole. This promise lies at the heart of many Eastern philosophical traditions, and it is precisely this promise that fascinated Hermann Hesse, while also provoking his deepest skepticism. When Western civilization entered a profound spiritual crisis, many intellectuals turned their gaze toward the East. They saw in the traditions of India and Buddhism a wisdom that seemed to transcend the restless anxieties of modern Europe. Where Western thoughts emphasized conflict, struggle, and individual assertion, Eastern philosophy often spoke of unity, detachment, and the dissolution of the ego. Hesse encountered these ideas not as a distant scholar, but as a seeker. His fascination with Indian philosophy and Buddhist thought shaped some of his most famous works, particularly the symbolic journey depicted in Siddhartha. Yet, his engagement with Eastern wisdom was never simple imitation. He did not accept the idea of spiritual harmony without resistance, because he sensed a danger hidden inside the promise of unity. The fundamental claim of many Eastern traditions is radical. The separation between the individual and the universe is an illusion. The suffering of the human being arises from attachment to the ego, from the belief that the self is isolated and permanent. Enlightenment occurs when this illusion dissolves and the individual recognizes their unity with the totality of existence. This vision offers immense relief. If the self is an illusion, then the torment of inner conflict loses its authority. The divisions between spirit and instinct, between good and evil, between suffering and joy, dissolve into a greater cosmic balance. But Hesse was not satisfied with this answer. He sensed that the human experience of division cannot be erased so easily. The conflict within the psyche is not merely a misunderstanding that can be corrected by spiritual insight. It is woven into the structure of human consciousness itself. This tension appears vividly in the journey of Siddhartha. At first, Siddhartha approaches enlightenment through the traditional path. He studies sacred teachings. He practices discipline. He seeks liberation through spiritual detachment. These methods promise freedom from desire and union with the eternal. But Siddhartha rejects them, not because they are false, but because they are incomplete. He realizes that wisdom transmitted through doctrine cannot replace lived experience. Enlightenment cannot be borrowed from teachers or scriptures. The individual must encounter life directly. This insight leads Siddhartha into the world of desire. He experiences wealth, sensual pleasure, ambition, and despair. He immerses himself in the very forces that spiritual traditions often condemn. At first, this immersion appears like a fall from purity, yet it reveals something crucial. The human soul cannot bypass existence. One cannot reach truth by escaping life. Hesse exposes here a profound tension between Eastern metaphysical unity and the Western emphasis on individual development. The Eastern vision dissolves the self into cosmic harmony. The Western existential impulse insists that the self must be forged through struggle. Hesse stands between these two worlds. He recognizes the wisdom of Eastern thought. The ego is indeed unstable. The boundaries between individual and universe are more fluid than everyday consciousness suggests. Moments of profound awareness can reveal a strange interconnectedness beneath the surface of reality. But he also understands that the human psyche does not experience existence as pure unity. It experiences conflict. Desire pulls in one direction. Moral consciousness pulls in another. Instinct demands expression, while spiritual aspiration demands restraint. The individual cannot simply dissolve these tensions through intellectual insight. They must live through them. This is why Siddhartha ultimately rejects every doctrine offered to him. He realizes that truth cannot be reduced to a philosophical formula. It emerges through direct engagement with existence. Even the Buddha, whom Siddhartha deeply respects, cannot provide the answer he seeks. The Buddha represents enlightenment as a completed state. Siddhartha senses that his own path cannot follow another person's realization. Truth must become personal. This realization transforms the meaning of enlightenment itself. Instead of escaping the contradictions of life, the individual must learn to experience them fully. Joy and suffering, gain and loss, desire and renunciation. All these elements belong to the fabric of existence. The river in Siddhartha becomes a powerful symbol of this understanding. The river flows continuously, yet remains the same river. Every moment changes, yet belongs to a larger unity. The lesson here is subtle. Unity does not eliminate multiplicity, it contains it. The individual does not transcend existence by rejecting its contradictions. Instead, they discover that those contradictions belong to a deeper pattern of life. Yet even this insight carries danger. because the idea of unity can become another form of escape. Modern seekers often romanticize Eastern philosophy. They imagine enlightenment as a peaceful state where conflict disappears and suffering dissolves. They turn spiritual practice into a strategy for emotional comfort. Hesse rejects this romanticism. He insists that genuine awareness does not anesthetize the human condition. It deepens it. The individual becomes more conscious of the complexity of existence, not less. The river teaches Siddhartha that every experience belongs to the same movement of life, but it does not remove pain from that movement. Suffering remains real. Loss remains real. The difference is that these experiences are no longer perceived as meaningless interruptions. They become part of a larger rhythm. Hesse's interpretation of Eastern philosophy therefore refuses simplistic harmony. He refuses the comforting illusion that enlightenment eliminates the tragic dimension of human existence. Instead, he suggests something more demanding. The individual must accept the paradox that life is both unity and division. The universe may possess an underlying coherence, but human consciousness encounters that coherence through fragmentation, through time, through suffering, through the struggle to understand. This insight becomes even more relevant in the modern world. In the culture of 2025, Eastern ideas have spread widely across the globe. Meditation, mindfulness, spiritual detachment. These concepts are often embraced as solutions to anxiety and existential confusion, but they are frequently stripped of their depth. Spiritual practices are transformed into tools for productivity or emotional stability. The deeper philosophical implications of Eastern thought are replaced by simplified promises of inner peace. Hesse would have recognized this distortion immediately, because he understood that true spiritual insight cannot be reduced to a technique. It requires the individual to confront the entire complexity of existence. Unity cannot be achieved by avoiding the darker elements of life. The individual must face desire, fear, loneliness, and contradiction. Only then can the deeper patterns of existence begin to reveal themselves. In this sense, Hesse transforms Eastern philosophy into a living tension rather than a final solution. The dream of unity remains powerful. It inspires the seeker to look beyond the narrow boundaries of the ego. But the path toward that unity passes through the chaos of human experience. The individual cannot dissolve the self without first discovering it. This paradox lies at the center of Hesse's spiritual vision. Enlightenment is not an escape from individuality. It is the culmination of a long journey through individuality. And yet another realization slowly emerges from this journey. If unity cannot erase the contradictions of existence, and if the individual must pass through suffering rather than escape it, then the question of meaning returns with even greater intensity. The seeker begins to ask not only how life can be understood, but how it can be expressed, how the inner complexity of existence can take form within the world. And it is precisely at this point that another path begins to reveal itself. A path where the struggle for meaning no longer seeks resolution in doctrine or metaphysics, but finds its most powerful expression in the creative act itself. The search for meaning cannot remain trapped inside philosophy alone. Thought can reveal the contradictions of existence, but it cannot fully contain them. At a certain point, the human soul reaches a boundary where concepts become too weak, too rigid, too slow to capture the living intensity of experience. When that boundary is reached, another path emerges with brutal clarity. Art is not decoration. Art is necessity. The individual who has confronted the divisions of the self, who has dismantled the false stability of society, and who has felt the tension between unity and fragmentation, soon discovers something unsettling. Understanding life intellectually does not resolve its chaos. Insight alone does not heal the fractures of the soul. The human being still burns with unanswered energy, desire, fear, ecstasy, despair, longing for transcendence. These forces cannot simply be analyzed and dismissed. They demand expression. If they remain trapped inside consciousness, they begin to poison the psyche. Hermann Hesse understood this with extraordinary precision. For him, art becomes the only space where the contradictions of existence can be lived without denial. Philosophy asks for coherence. Society demands order. Religion often seeks purity, but art allows the human soul to reveal itself in its full complexity. Art does not resolve contradictions, it gives them form. This insight explains why the artist occupies a strange and uncomfortable position in every civilization. The artist does not fully belong to the structures that surround them. They move at the edges of society, both observing and resisting its norms. Because the artist is driven by something deeper than social approval, they are driven by the need to translate inner experience into visible form. This act of translation is not merely aesthetic, it is existential. The artist does not create simply to entertain others. They create in order to survive psychologically. Without expression, the forces within the soul would tear the individual apart. Hesse recognized the artist as a kind of spiritual experimenter. Just as his fictional characters function as laboratories for philosophical transformation, the artist becomes a living instrument through which the chaos of existence is transformed into meaning. But this transformation is never complete. Art does not eliminate suffering, it reveals it. Art does not solve the riddle of existence, it intensifies the confrontation with that riddle. This is why genuine creativity always contains a dangerous element. The artist must venture into the depths of the psyche where ordinary consciousness hesitates to go. They must encounter impulses, memories, fears, and visions that remain hidden from everyday life. To create authentically is to expose the inner world without censorship. And this exposure can be terrifying because the unconscious does not speak politely. It erupts with images that challenge moral order and rational clarity. Beauty appears next to cruelty. Insight appears next to madness. The artist must hold these opposites without fleeing. Hesse himself lived this tension. He was not merely an observer of psychological struggle. His own life was marked by periods of intense crisis, depression, alienation, spiritual confusion. Writing became the space where these experiences could be confronted rather than suppressed. Through literature, he transformed inner turmoil into symbolic narratives that revealed universal truths. This transformation demonstrates the deeper function of art. Art does not escape reality. It penetrates reality more deeply than ordinary perception allows. Where daily life simplifies experience into categories and routines, art restores complexity. It shows the hidden layers of consciousness that remain invisible within social interaction. The artist therefore becomes a kind of translator between worlds. One world is the structured reality of society, with its expectations and rules. The other is the fluid and chaotic landscape of the psyche. The artist moves between these two realms, carrying fragments of the inner world into visible form. This role inevitably creates tension with the surrounding culture. Society values stability. It prefers identities that remain predictable. But art introduces disturbance. It reveals contradictions that polite civilization prefers to ignore. This is why artists are often admired and feared at the same time. Their creations can illuminate hidden truths about human existence. But those truths often threaten the illusions that maintain social order. Hesse understood that the artist therefore lives in permanent exile, not necessarily geographic exile, but psychological distance from the collective mentality of society. The artist sees too much. They cannot fully believe the narratives that others accept without question. Yet this distance is also a source of power because it allows the artist to explore dimensions of existence that remain inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. In Hesse's philosophical vision, art becomes the bridge between inner conflict and meaningful expression. The divided self that struggles between instinct and spirit finds temporary reconciliation through creative form. The tensions of the psyche are not eliminated, but they are arranged into patterns that reveal hidden relationships. This arrangement produces a strange kind of clarity, not the clarity of logical explanation, but the clarity of symbolic insight. Through stories, images, music, and poetry, the human soul begins to recognize aspects of itself that cannot be captured by abstract reasoning. Art, therefore, becomes a method of self-knowledge. When a reader encounters a powerful narrative, something unexpected occurs. The reader recognizes fragments of their own inner life reflected in the work. Emotions that were previously vague suddenly appear with precision. The work of art becomes a mirror. But it is a mirror that reflects not the surface identity presented to society, but the deeper psychological currents beneath that surface. This is why Hesse's characters continue to resonate across generations. They embody psychological struggles that belong to the fundamental structure of human existence. The reader does not simply observe these characters. The reader confronts themselves through them. This confrontation can be unsettling because art removes the protective distance between observer and experience. It forces the individual to acknowledge emotions and questions they might prefer to avoid. Yet this discomfort is precisely what makes art transformative. Through aesthetic experience, the individual begins to develop a new relationship with their own inner complexity. Instead of fearing the contradictions of the psyche, they begin to perceive them as sources of creativity. The chaos of the inner world becomes material for meaning. Hesse believed that this transformation represents one of the highest possibilities of human life. Not because art provides final answers, but because it allows the individual to participate actively in the creation of meaning. Existence does not offer ready-made significance. The individual must shape significance from experience. The artist demonstrates that such shaping is possible. By transforming suffering into narrative, confusion into image, and longing into music, the artist reveals that the raw materials of life can become something more than despair. They can become form. But this possibility introduces another paradox. The act of creation does not end the search for meaning. It deepens it. Every artistic expression reveals new layers of experience that demand further exploration. The artist discovers that meaning is not a static achievement. It is a continuous process of engagement with existence. In the modern world of 2025, this insight becomes even more urgent. Human life is increasingly surrounded by artificial stimulation. Images flood every screen. Words multiply endlessly across digital landscapes. Yet much of this production lacks depth because it avoids genuine confrontation with the inner world. True art cannot be manufactured by algorithms or marketing strategies. It emerges only when an individual dares to face the full intensity of their own experience. This courage remains rare. Most people prefer distraction. They consume endless streams of information that keep deeper questions at a distance. But the hunger for meaning does not disappear. Beneath the noise of modern life, the same existential tensions continue to move within the human soul. The artist listens to that tension, and by giving it form, the artist reminds others that existence contains layers far deeper than daily routines suggest. Yet, even the most profound artistic expression cannot fully resolve the mystery of being. Creativity illuminates the human condition, but it also reveals how fragile our understanding remains. Because behind every work of art stands the same questions that have haunted the seeker from the beginning. Why does suffering shape consciousness so deeply? Why do moments of beauty appear so intensely and disappear so quickly? Why does time seem to carry the human being forward while something inside longs for permanence? And as these questions grow sharper, the individual begins to realize that the struggle for meaning cannot be separated from another dimension of existence that quietly governs every human life. The strange relationship between time, suffering, and the fleeting moments in which eternity seems to reveal itself. Time is the most silent tyrant of human existence. It governs every moment of life, yet almost no one truly understands it. We speak of the past as if it were gone, of the future as if it were approaching, and of the present as if it were a thin bridge between two emptinesses. But beneath this ordinary perception lies a deeper and far more unsettling possibility. Time may not be what we think it is. Human consciousness experiences life as a sequence. One moment replaces another. Childhood becomes adulthood. Joy becomes memory. Loss becomes history. Everything appears to move forward in an irreversible flow. This movement produces the fundamental tension of existence. We feel life intensely precisely because we know it cannot remain. Every love risks disappearance. Every insight fades. Every living moment slips into memory. From this awareness, suffering emerges. Hermann Hesse understood that suffering is not merely an unfortunate accident of life. It is tied directly to the way human beings experience time. To exist as a conscious being means to perceive change. And to perceive change means to encounter loss. The moment we recognize beauty, we also recognize that beauty cannot last. The moment we experience love, we feel the shadow of its possible ending. Time turns every joy into something fragile. For many people, this realization produces despair. They try to escape the pain of impermanence through distraction. They fill life with activity, ambition, and routine. By keeping the mind constantly occupied, they hope to avoid confronting the deeper structure of existence. But the seeker in Hesse's universe cannot escape this confrontation. The awareness of time becomes sharper as the journey inward deepens. The individual begins to sense that life is not merely passing. Something more complex is unfolding beneath the surface of temporal experience. This realization appears symbolically in the moment when Siddhartha listens to the river. The river flows endlessly. Every drop of water moves forward, yet the river itself remains. The present moment seems to disappear into the next, but the total movement of the river forms a single, continuous reality. Siddhartha hears something within that movement, a strange harmony that does not deny change, but includes it. The past, the present, and the future appear not as separate territories, but as different expressions of the same unfolding existence. This insight challenges the ordinary perception of time. Instead of imagining life as a straight line, Siddhartha begins to sense something closer to a circle. Every moment contains echoes of all other moments. The boundaries between past and future begin to blur. What seems like disappearance may actually be transformation. But this awareness does not remove suffering. On the contrary, it deepens the individual's sensitivity to life. When one recognizes that every moment is unique and irreplaceable, experience becomes more intense. Joy shines brighter because it is temporary. Pain cuts deeper because it reveals the vulnerability of existence. Suffering becomes inseparable from consciousness itself. Hesse does not present suffering as an obstacle that must be eliminated. He presents it as a teacher. Every stage of his character's journeys is marked by periods of pain, confusion, and loss. These experiences do not appear as punishments. They function as catalysts. Without suffering, the individual would never question inherited meanings. Without suffering, the comfortable illusions of society would remain intact. Without suffering, the deeper layers of the psyche would remain unexplored. Pain breaks the shell of ordinary life. It forces the individual to look inward. This insight reflects a profound psychological truth. Human beings rarely change when life is easy. Stability encourages repetition. Familiar patterns feel safe, even when they lack meaning. But suffering interrupts repetition. When the structures that once supported identity collapse, the individual is pushed into reflection. Questions arise that were previously ignored. Who am I beneath the roles I perform? What remains when certainty disappears? Through this confrontation, suffering becomes a gateway to transformation. Yet Hesse also recognized that suffering alone does not guarantee growth. Pain can produce bitterness just as easily as wisdom. The difference lies in how the individual responds. One person may close themselves in resentment. Another may allow suffering to deepen their awareness. The seeker must learn to endure suffering without allowing it to destroy the capacity for wonder. Because hidden inside the experience of time and suffering, there occasionally appears something extraordinary. A moment that feels different from ordinary experience. A moment in which the flow of time seems to pause. These moments are rare but unforgettable. A piece of music suddenly reveals a profound emotional truth. A landscape appears so beautiful that the observer forgets themselves entirely. A conversation touches a level of understanding that feels timeless. In such moments, the individual experiences what Hesse suggests is a glimpse of eternity. Not eternity as an abstract metaphysical concept, but eternity as an intensity of presence. The individual is no longer trapped between memory and anticipation. They are fully immersed in the living moment. Time does not disappear, but it loses its tyranny. The mind stops measuring experience in terms of before and after. Instead, it inhabits the depth of the present. These moments cannot be forced. They appear unpredictably, yet they reveal something essential about human consciousness. Beneath the restless movement of time lies another dimension of experience, a dimension where life feels complete within a single instant. Art can evoke this dimension. Love can evoke it. Deep contemplation can evoke it. Even suffering itself can sometimes open the door to it. The individual suddenly recognizes that existence contains a depth far beyond ordinary perception. But these glimpses of eternity do not remain permanently. Soon the ordinary flow of time returns. Responsibilities reappear. The mind resumes its endless movement between past and future. The moment fades, and yet something has changed. The individual now knows that another level of reality exists within experience, a level where the divisions of time become less absolute. This knowledge does not eliminate suffering, but it transforms its meaning. Pain becomes part of the larger rhythm of existence. Loss becomes inseparable from the beauty that preceded it. Time becomes not merely an enemy, but a mysterious force through which life reveals its depth. Hesse's characters carry this awareness forward as they continue their journeys. They have glimpsed something beyond the narrow boundaries of ordinary identity. Yet another unsettling realization slowly emerges. If time reveals that the self is constantly changing, and if moments of eternity reveal that identity can dissolve into pure experience, then the question arises again with renewed intensity. What exactly is the self that moves through all these transformations? Is there truly a single identity enduring through time? Or is the human being something far more complex, a shifting constellation of many selves speaking within the same consciousness? The self is not a single voice, it is a crowd. Human beings speak about identity as if it were a solid object. We say I, as if that word refers to something stable and unified. But the deeper the individual looks into their own consciousness, the more fragile this assumption becomes. Beneath the surface of ordinary awareness lives not one personality, but many. The idea of a singular self is one of the most comforting illusions of civilization. Society needs individuals to appear consistent. Institutions require predictable behavior. Moral systems depend on the belief that a person possesses a stable character that can be judged and categorized. Without this assumption, social order would become impossible to maintain. But psychological reality is far more chaotic. Inside every human being, there exists a shifting constellation of impulses, memories, fears, ambitions, and desires. These forces do not speak with a single voice. They argue, contradict, and compete for influence. At one moment, compassion dominates. At another moment, anger takes control. At one moment, the individual seeks solitude. At another moment, they crave recognition and connection. The self changes from hour to hour. Hermann Hesse understood this multiplicity with unusual clarity. Long before contemporary psychology developed models of fragmented identity, he portrayed the human being as a dynamic and plural structure. This insight appears most vividly in the psychological universe of Harry Haller. Haller initially believes he is divided into two parts. One side represents cultivated humanity. The other represents the wild instincts of the wolf. He interprets this division as a tragic flaw. He feels condemned to live between incompatible worlds. But this interpretation is still too simple. The deeper revelation Haller eventually confronts is far more radical. The self is not composed of two opposing forces. It contains countless potential identities. The idea that a person is either civilized or animalistic, rational or emotional, spiritual or sensual, is only another simplification imposed by the mind. In reality, the psyche contains a vast multiplicity of possibilities. Hesse illustrates this through the symbolic image of the magic theater. In this strange psychological space, Allah encounters countless versions of himself. Each version represents a different potential identity. One version is playful and joyful. Another is cruel. Another is deeply creative. Another is fragile and afraid. These identities coexist within the same consciousness. The magic theater reveals a terrifying but liberating truth. The self is not fixed. Identity is a field of possibilities. This realization shatters the rigid self-image that society encourages individuals to maintain. The person who believes they are defined by a single personality suddenly discovers that this personality is only one arrangement among many. The implications are profound. If the self is plural, then personal transformation becomes possible in ways that ordinary thinking cannot imagine. The individual is not imprisoned by their current identity. Beneath the surface lie other potential ways of being. But this discovery also introduces a dangerous instability. Without a stable identity, the individual may feel disoriented. If countless selves exist within the psyche, which one should guide action? Which voice deserves trust? Many people avoid confronting this multiplicity because it threatens their sense of control. They prefer the illusion of a unified personality, even if that personality feels incomplete. Hesse challenges this preference. He suggests that genuine self-knowledge requires acknowledging the many voices that inhabit the psyche. The goal is not to eliminate this multiplicity. It is to become conscious of it. The individual must learn to observe the shifting patterns of identity without panic. Instead of clinging to a single definition of the self, the seeker begins to see identity as fluid. Different aspects of the psyche emerge in different circumstances. No single version of the self can claim absolute authority. This perspective transforms the experience of inner conflict. Previously, the individual believed that contradictory impulses represented personal failure. If one part of the psyche desired discipline, while another sought freedom, the person felt divided and confused. But when multiplicity is accepted, contradiction becomes natural. The psyche is not malfunctioning when different voices appear. It is revealing its complexity. Hesse understood that psychological maturity requires developing a new relationship with this complexity. The individual must become capable of holding multiple identities within awareness without being dominated by any single one. This requires a subtle kind of consciousness. The person begins to observe their own psychological movements, as if watching actors on a stage. Anger arises, but it is recognized as one voice among many. Fear appears, but it does not define the entire self. Joy emerges, but it does not erase the presence of sadness.
The individual becomes the witness of their own multiplicity. Through this awareness, a new form of freedom emerges. Freedom no longer means choosing one identity and suppressing all others. It means navigating the many dimensions of the psyche with intelligence and creativity. The individual becomes less rigid, less trapped by self-definitions. A person who once believed they were fundamentally timid may discover hidden courage. Someone who identified as purely rational may uncover a powerful, imaginative life. A personality that seemed fixed begins to reveal unexpected possibilities. Yet this liberation also demands responsibility, because once the illusion of a fixed self dissolves, the individual cannot hide behind it anymore. They must consciously participate in shaping their own psychological landscape. Identity becomes a creative act. This insight resonates deeply in the world of 2025. Modern life exposes individuals to an unprecedented variety of roles and identities. Social media profiles, professional personas, private selves, digital avatars. People move between these identities constantly. But without inner awareness, this multiplicity often produces confusion rather than freedom. Individuals may feel fragmented, uncertain of who they truly are. Hesse's philosophy offers a different interpretation. The multiplicity of the self is not a problem that must be solved. It is a reality that must be understood. The individual does not need to discover a single authentic identity hidden beneath all others. Instead, they must develop the capacity to hold many aspects of themselves in conscious dialogue. This dialogue creates psychological depth. The individual becomes less dogmatic, less certain of simple answers. They recognize that human existence cannot be reduced to a single narrative. Life unfolds through countless internal perspectives, interacting with one another. And yet, this multiplicity introduces another challenge that cannot be ignored. If the self contains many voices, then the relationship between individuals becomes even more complex. Every person carries within them an entire psychological universe. When two individuals encounter each other, it is not merely two personalities meeting. It is two constellations of selves interacting in unpredictable ways. And from this realization, a new question begins to emerge with quiet but relentless force. How can individuals who contain such inner complexity ever truly understand one another or build communities that do not crush the fragile search for truth that unfolds within the solitary depths of the human soul? The encounter with another human being is never simple. Two individuals do not merely meet as stable personalities. They arrive carrying entire inner worlds. Each person brings their hidden contradictions, their suppressed desires, their fears, their hopes, and the countless voices that speak within their own consciousness. When two people face one another, it is not a conversation between two unified selves. It is a collision between two psychological universes. And this collision reveals a difficult truth. The search for the self inevitably produces solitude. The individual who begins to question society, who confronts the depths of the psyche, who recognizes the multiplicity of identity, gradually finds themselves separated from the collective rhythm of the surrounding world. Not because they desire isolation, but because the inner journey changes the way reality is perceived. The ordinary world begins to feel strange. The conversations that once seemed meaningful begin to sound mechanical. Social rituals appear repetitive. The endless pursuit of success, approval, and stability begins to look like a carefully organized distraction from deeper questions.
Hermann Hesse understood that this realization places the seeker in a difficult position. Human beings cannot exist entirely alone. We depend on others for survival, communication, recognition, and emotional connection. Yet the individual who begins to pursue authentic self-knowledge often discovers that the surrounding community cannot follow them into that depth. This produces a tension that lies at the heart of modern existence. The individual needs society, but society resists the individual who refuses to conform. Communities function through shared values. They depend on agreement about what is normal, respectable, and meaningful. Without this agreement, collective life becomes unstable. Every society, therefore, develops subtle mechanisms that encourage conformity. These mechanisms do not always appear violent. Often, they are gentle. Approval is granted to those who behave predictably. Respect is given to those who follow accepted paths. Recognition is reserved for individuals who reinforce the identity of the community itself. Those who deviate from these patterns are treated with suspicion. Sometimes they are ignored. Sometimes they are mocked. Sometimes they are labeled strange or dangerous. In extreme cases, they are excluded entirely. Hesse saw this process clearly within the structure of modern civilization. The bourgeois world, with its obsession with moderation and stability, could tolerate creativity only when it remained harmless. True individuality threatened the quiet order that society depended upon. The seeker therefore faces a difficult dilemma. To remain fully integrated into the community often requires suppressing the deeper impulses of the inner self. But to follow those impulses honestly can lead to social isolation. Many people resolve this dilemma by dividing their lives. They maintain a public identity that satisfies society while privately exploring their inner questions. Yet this division eventually becomes exhausting. The individual feels as if they are performing two different lives. Hesse's characters refuse this compromise. They move toward authenticity, even when it distances them from the collective. This movement does not arise from arrogance. It arises from necessity. Once the inner voice begins to speak clearly, ignoring it becomes psychologically unbearable. Yet, the solitude that follows is painful. The human being longs for recognition. We want others to see us, to understand us, to confirm that our experiences are real. When the seeker enters territories of consciousness unfamiliar to the surrounding world, this recognition becomes difficult to obtain. The individual may feel invisible. This loneliness is not merely emotional, it is existential. The seeker begins to realize that no one else can fully live their inner journey. Teachers may guide, friends may offer support, but the deepest decisions of existence must be faced alone. Every individual must confront their own contradictions. Every individual must listen to their own inner voice. Every individual must construct meaning from the raw material of experience. This solitude reveals another dimension of the human condition, the problem of the other. How can two individuals truly understand one another when each carries such a complex and shifting interior world? Language attempts to bridge this gap. Through words, we try to communicate our thoughts and feelings, but language is limited. It reduces the richness of experience into simplified symbols. A sentence can suggest an emotion, but it cannot fully transmit the living intensity of that emotion. This limitation produces misunderstandings that shape every human relationship. People believe they understand one another, while entire layers of inner experience remain unspoken. Hesse recognized that this difficulty extends beyond personal relationships into the realm of politics and collective life. Political systems attempt to organize human communities through shared rules and institutions. They promise order, justice, and stability. But politics often operates on simplified assumptions about human nature. It treats individuals as predictable units within a social structure. Yet the deeper psychological reality revealed in Hesse's philosophy contradicts this simplification. The human being is not a stable unit. The self is plural, contradictory, and constantly evolving. When political systems ignore this complexity, they inevitably produce tension. Ideologies attempt to define what people should believe. Institutions attempt to regulate behavior. But the inner life of individuals remains far more unpredictable than any system can fully control. This is why moments of historical crisis often appear suddenly. Beneath the visible structure of society, countless individual tensions accumulate silently. Frustrations, suppressed desires, and conflicting identities gather beneath the surface. Eventually, the pressure becomes too great. The collective order fractures. Hesse lived during a period when such fractures reshaped entire civilizations. Wars, revolutions, ideological conflicts. These events revealed how fragile the structures of society truly were. Yet Hesse's response was not primarily political. He did not believe that changing institutions alone could resolve the deeper crisis of modern civilization. The problem lay deeper, inside the structure of the human psyche itself. Societies are built from individuals. If individuals remain unconscious of their inner contradictions, the communities they create will inevitably reflect that confusion. Collective conflicts often mirror the unresolved tensions within human consciousness. For this reason, Hesse returned again and again to the importance of the individual journey. The transformation of society cannot occur through external reform alone. It requires individuals who are willing to confront the depths of their own being. Yet this focus on the individual does not eliminate the longing for connection. The seeker does not wish to remain permanently isolated. The deeper hope is that individuals who have confronted themselves honestly might someday encounter others who have undertaken the same difficult journey. Such encounters are rare, but when they occur, something extraordinary becomes possible. Two individuals meet, not through social roles, but through shared awareness of the complexity of existence. Conversation becomes deeper. Silence becomes meaningful. The presence of another person no longer demands conformity, but invites authenticity. These moments hint at a different kind of community. Not a community built upon rigid identities and enforced agreement, but a community formed through individuals who recognize the depth and ambiguity of human life. Yet this vision remains fragile because the world continues to pull individuals back towards simpler identities and collective certainty. The tension between individuality and community never fully disappears. And as the seeker reflects on this tension, another realization slowly emerges from the long journey through division, suffering, creativity, and solitude. All these experiences appear separate at first, yet beneath them there may exist a deeper pattern waiting to be understood. A pattern capable of bringing the scattered elements of this philosophical journey into a single and unsettling vision of what the human being truly is. The human journey towards selfhood does not end with the final answer. It ends with a deeper vision of the problem. After the long confrontation with instinct and spirit, after the destruction of social illusions, after the discovery of the inner voice, after the encounter with Eastern wisdom, art suffering, time, multiplicity, and solitude. Something slowly becomes visible beneath the fragments. The human being is not a finished creature. Human existence is a process. This realization forms the quiet center of Hermann Hesse's philosophical vision. He never presents a closed system. He never claims to possess a final doctrine that resolves the contradictions of life. Instead, he reveals a dynamic understanding of the human condition. Man is not a stable identity moving through time. Man is a movement. This movement unfolds between opposing forces that cannot be eliminated: spirit and instinct, order and chaos, individual freedom and communal belonging, suffering and meaning, unity and fragmentation. Every stage of the journey explored so far exposes another dimension of this tension. The individual begins life inside structures built by society. Family, culture, religion, and tradition provide the first shape of identity. At this stage, the self feels simple because it has not yet encountered its own complexity. But awakening begins with disturbance. The person senses that inherited meanings are insufficient. The comfortable stability of the bourgeois world begins to feel hollow. Questions appear that cannot be answered through obedience or routine. This moment marks the birth of the philosophical individual. From there, the journey deepens through conflict. The seeker confronts the division between spirit and nature. The civilized self discovers that instinct has not disappeared. Beneath morality lies desire. Beneath discipline lies chaos. The human being is divided, yet this division is not a defect that can be corrected. It is the condition that generates consciousness itself. Without conflict, there would be no self-reflection. The individual then encounters society as a system that attempts to hide this division. Civilization demands stability, but stability requires repression. The price of belonging becomes the denial of inner complexity. The seeker must therefore break away. This break introduces solitude. The individual stands outside the collective narratives that once defined reality. At first, this freedom appears exhilarating, but it soon reveals its darker side. Freedom means responsibility. If society no longer dictates meaning, the individual must create meaning. This responsibility leads inward. The seeker begins to listen to the deeper voice of the psyche. The unconscious reveals forces that contradict the simplified image of the self. Identity becomes fluid. The self reveals itself not as a single entity, but as a multiplicity of possibilities. Human consciousness contains countless potential identities waiting to be expressed. This discovery can either destroy the individual or liberate them. Hesse suggests that liberation becomes possible only when the person stops searching for a final identity. Instead, they learn to move consciously through the many dimensions of their own being. Art becomes one expression of this movement. Through creative form, the individual gives shape to inner contradictions that cannot be resolved through logic. The artist does not escape suffering. The artist transforms suffering into language, image, rhythm, and symbol. Creation becomes a way of living with complexity. Time then introduces another dimension of the journey. The individual recognizes that every experience is temporary. Life flows forward with relentless motion. Yet within this flow there appear moments of extraordinary presence, moments where time seems to dissolve and existence reveals its depth. These moments do not cancel suffering, they illuminate it. Suffering becomes part of the structure of meaning. Through suffering, the individual becomes capable of deeper perception.
Pain breaks the illusions that protect the ordinary self. Loss forces consciousness to confront the fragility of existence. What emerges from this confrontation is not despair, but awareness. The individual begins to see that human life is not designed to achieve perfect harmony. Instead, it is structured around the continual negotiation between opposing forces. Eastern philosophy hints at unity. Western existentialism emphasizes conflict. Hesse's vision stands between them. Unity exists, but it does not erase division. The human being must live within contradiction. This insight leads to the final synthesis of Hesse's thought. The individual is not meant to escape life's tensions. The individual is meant to become conscious of them. To live authentically means to participate actively in the unfolding drama of existence. The seeker learns to move between instinct and spirit without denying either. To engage with society without losing individuality. To accept suffering without surrendering to despair. Such a life does not appear heroic in the traditional sense. It is quieter. It is marked by constant self-examination, by openness to change, by the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about one's own nature. Hesse's characters embody this attitude. Siddhartha listening to the river, Harry Haller wandering through the labyrinth of the psyche, Emil Sinclair discovering that good and evil are not simple opposites. Each figure represents a stage in the evolution of consciousness. They do not arrive at perfect answers. They arrive at deeper questions. This is why Hesse's work continues to resonate in the world of 2025. Modern civilization has multiplied the complexity of human life. Technology accelerates time. Information floods consciousness. Social identities shift constantly. Yet the fundamental questions remain unchanged. Who am I beneath the roles I perform? How should I live within a world that contains both beauty and cruelty? What does it mean to become a self? Hesse's philosophy offers no comforting conclusion. It refuses the illusion that existence can be simplified into a single formula. Instead, it leaves the individual standing at the threshold of awareness. The journey towards selfhood has revealed that human identity is fluid, contradictory, and unfinished. The seeker understands that the search for meaning will never end. And it is precisely here, at the edge of that endless search, where the most unsettling recognition begins to appear. The individual finally realizes that the question they have been pursuing throughout the entire journey was never simply about understanding life. It was about confronting the terrifying freedom of being responsible for creating it. The philosophy of Hermann Hesse does not end with certainty. It ends with a challenge. Throughout this exploration, we have seen that Hesse never constructs a rigid philosophical system. Instead, he reveals a living process. His characters do not simply represent ideas, they undergo transformation. Through their struggles, crises, and awakenings, Hesse turns literature into a laboratory of the human soul. What ultimately emerges from this journey is not a final answer to the question of human existence, but a deeper understanding of its structure. Human life is defined by tension, the tension between spirit and instinct, the tension between the individual and society, the tension between unity and fragmentation, the tension between suffering and meaning. Hesse does not attempt to eliminate these contradictions. Instead, he reveals that they are the very conditions that make selfhood possible. Without inner conflict, there would be no consciousness. Without crisis, there will be no transformation. Without suffering, there will be no depth. For this reason, the goal of life in Hesse's vision is not perfection. The goal is awakening. To become oneself does not mean discovering a fixed identity hidden somewhere inside the soul. It means developing the courage to confront the complexity of one's own nature. It means recognizing that the human being contains contradictions that cannot be simplified. This recognition demands responsibility. Once the individual realizes that meaning cannot simply be inherited from society, religion, or tradition, a new task appears. Each person must actively participate in shaping their own life. Authentic existence becomes an act of creation rather than obedience. In this sense, Hesse stands at the intersection of literature, philosophy, and psychology. His work anticipates many insights that would later emerge in existential philosophy and depth psychology. But he communicates those insights not through abstract theory, but through narrative experience. The reader does not merely learn Hesse's ideas. The reader lives through them. This is why his works continue to resonate in the modern world. Even in the age of technology, speed, and information overload, the fundamental questions remain unchanged. People still struggle with the same inner divisions. They still search for meaning beyond social expectations. They still feel the quiet but persistent call to understand themselves. Hesse reminds us that this search is not a weakness. It is the beginning of consciousness. In a world increasingly filled with noise, distraction, and ready-made identities, the most difficult task may still be the one Hesse placed at the center of his philosophy: to turn inward, to confront the contradictions within the self, and to continue the long, uncertain, and profoundly human journey of becoming who we truly are.